You know what's strange? An entire generation grew up hearing they could achieve anything they wanted, only to enter adulthood and realize the path they were promised barely exists anymore. It's like being trained for a race where someone quietly moved the finish line. I'm talking about millennials, people born roughly between 1981 and 1996. And before you dismiss this as another generational debate, stay with me for a moment, because the psychology behind it is more complicated than most people realize. Millennials are the first generation in modern American history widely expected to end up financially worse off than their parents. Researchers have been pointing this out for years, which means millions of people are walking around with a strange mix of ambition and disappointment sitting in their minds at the same time. Think about the message many millennials grew up with. Work hard, go to college, follow the rules, build a successful life. But when many of them graduated, the global financial crisis had already changed the landscape. Suddenly, the same degree that once opened doors now came with massive debt and fewer opportunities. Psychology has a name for this kind of inner conflict: cognitive dissonance. It happens when the reality you experience doesn't match the beliefs you were taught to trust, and millennials have been living in that tension for years. But this story goes deeper than economics. Psychologist Jean Twenge studied millennials extensively and wrote about them in her research on generational psychology. Her findings revealed something fascinating. Millennials tend to score higher on traits related to self-focus and personal identity, yet at the same time, they also report higher levels of anxiety and depression. In other words, a generation raised to believe they were extraordinary, but often feeling like they're falling behind. It sounds contradictory, but psychologically, it makes sense. Many millennials were raised during the peak of the self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s. Parenting advice emphasized encouragement, protection, and constant reassurance. The idea was simple: confident kids would grow into successful adults. Those intentions weren't harmful. In fact, they came from a genuine desire to raise healthier, happier children. But life had other plans. When millennials reached adulthood, the economy shifted dramatically. The 2008 recession reshaped the job market. Housing prices climbed rapidly, and stable career paths became far less predictable than before. For many people, it felt like the rules of the game had changed right as they stepped onto the field. And then there was social media. Millennials were the first generation to experience platforms like Facebook and Instagram while their adult identities were still forming. They didn't grow up fully online like Gen Z, but they also didn't have the distance older generations had. They learned how to navigate adulthood while simultaneously learning how to present their lives to an audience. Research by psychologist Tim Kasser has shown that when people start tying their self-worth to external validation, things like approval, status, or attention, mental well-being tends to decline. Social media, by design, encourages exactly that dynamic. It turns everyday life into a constant performance. And when you combine that with economic uncertainty, the pressure becomes even heavier. Another factor rarely discussed is how millennials have had to delay many of the traditional milestones that once defined adulthood, things like buying a home, starting a family, or achieving long-term financial stability. Surveys consistently show that many millennials still want these things, but rising costs and unstable job markets make it harder to reach than they were for previous generations. The result is a strange psychological state. People in their 30s or even 40s sometimes feel like their real life hasn't fully begun yet, not because they lack ambition, but because the timeline society once promised no longer matches reality. Psychologists often describe the stress created by prolonged uncertainty as allostatic load. It's the strain your mind and body experience when they remain in a constant state of preparation for challenges that never fully resolve. It's like waiting for something important to happen while the clock keeps moving forward. Another major shift involves the relationship millennials have with institutions. Many grew up believing that effort would naturally lead to stability. Study hard, build a career, and gradually move upward. But the economic environment they entered looked very different. College costs rose dramatically, Entry-level positions often demanded years of experience, and stable employment increasingly gave way to contract work and short-term gigs. Psychologists call this kind of experience schema disruption. It happens when your core assumptions about how the world works suddenly collapse. And when that disruption affects millions of people at once, it reshapes how an entire generation views authority, work, and the future. This might explain why millennials are often described as both hopeful and skeptical at the same time. They still believe fairness and opportunity should exist, they just aren't always convinced the system will deliver it. Critics sometimes accuse millennials of lacking loyalty in the workplace because they switch jobs more frequently than previous generations. But there's another way to interpret that behavior. Over the past few decades, companies themselves changed the nature of employment. Long-term pensions disappeared, layoffs became common, and stable employment gradually weakened. Millennials didn't create that environment, they simply adapted to it, and in many ways, their response is rational. There's also something important that often gets overlooked. Millennials are one of the most educated and diverse generations in history. They grew up alongside the rapid expansion of the internet, gaining access to information and perspectives previous generations never had. This exposure tends to shape how people think. When you grow up seeing multiple viewpoints and narratives online, you naturally become more skeptical of simple explanations. Questioning systems and authority becomes normal. Of course, people who question the status quo often get labeled as difficult or entitled. But sometimes that's just what critical thinking looks like. Another area where millennials stand out is mental health awareness. They're among the first generations to openly discuss therapy, anxiety, and emotional well-being as legitimate parts of life rather than personal weaknesses. That shift is culturally significant, but it's also happening while many millennials face high levels of financial pressure, job instability, and social comparison. So you end up with a generation that is simultaneously more self-aware and more overwhelmed. And then there's the future. Millennials are also living through an era where global challenges, economic, environmental, and political, feel increasingly visible and urgent. Many feel responsible for solving problems that developed long before they had the power to influence them. That combination can create a unique psychological weight. So, when people ask why millennials seem anxious, uncertain, or frustrated, the answer becomes clearer when you look at the environment they've been navigating. A generation raised with high expectations, shaped by rapid technological change, economic instability, and constant social comparison. The psychology isn't mysterious at all. It's simply what happens when the world changes faster than the roadmap people were given. If this perspective resonated with you, consider subscribing. And if you enjoy these deeper psychology explorations, joining the channel helps support more videos like this.